Welcome to Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone and the Libertarian Institute. Today I am honored to have Matt Ridley. He is a British journalist, a member of the House of Lords, an author of books that have sold over 1 million copies that have been translated into 31 languages. What an accomplishment. I mean, 31 languages. I'm still trying to nail down English, and he's at 31 languages. Unbelievable. Find him at mattridley.co.uk. Links, of course, will be in the description below. We're going to go over 3 books today: The Rational Optimist, How Innovation Works, and The Evolution of Everything. Mr. Ridley, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Keith, for having me on your show.
Now, before we get into these 3, you have committed a number of thought crimes with a new book you have titled Viral: The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. You co-authored this with a scientist, Alina Chan, from Harvard and MIT's Broad Institute. What is your thesis behind this book?
Our thesis behind that book is very simple, that it's extremely important that the world finds out how this pandemic began so that we can prevent the next one. That unlike the case of SARS and a lot of other recent outbreaks, we don't know. We haven't got a smoking gun to tell us the answer. It looks we're not getting full cooperation and transparency from the Chinese government that would enable us to solve this problem. But the evidence we have seen suggests that the favored explanation at the start, that it was the result of someone buying an animal in the market that had somehow been in contact with a bat and picked up the virus that way, doesn't seem to make sense. We've not been able to find an infected animal despite 80,000 animals being tested by the Chinese, etc., etc. And it's looking more and more likely that it is not a coincidence that Wuhan is the one city in the world with the biggest collection of bat-borne SARS-like coronaviruses in the world by some distance, and has been manipulating as well as collecting those viruses on a huge scale, but only in the last 10 or 15 years. So that does seem to indicate, and the more we found out about the experiments they were doing in Wuhan on these viruses, the more we think it's important to properly investigate the possibility that this came from a laboratory. So we think it's an open question. It could have come through the market. It could have come through the laboratory. It's pretty shocking that we don't know, that the Chinese are not being particularly helpful in letting us find out. And the evidence is very intriguing and deserves a book, a detective story, a whodunit, if you like, in its own right already. That's our thesis, and it's been an extraordinary experience writing that book. One of the most fascinating, but also rather alarming things that I've done. And I had the great privilege of collaborating with a brilliant young scientist, Alina Chan, at the Broad Institute, as you mentioned.
When it comes to the first cases, where did the first cases occur? Were they in this wet market area? Were they close to this Institute of Virology? Can you give us a geographical area of where this started?
Well, not entirely, no, because we're dealing with partial bits of information. But what we do know is that it started in Wuhan. The evidence that it was anywhere else but Wuhan before November or December of 2019 is very, very thin indeed. And the first cases were detected sometime around the middle of November, we think. We've seen one leaked document from the Chinese authorities giving a case of the 17th of November as the earliest. They then denied that and said that the first case was the 1st of December, and then later they said maybe it was the 8th of December. Nobody believes it began that late. I mean, everybody thinks, if you look at the genetics, if you look at the case numbers, etc., it was probably the first human being was probably infected in either late October or mid-November 2019, sometime in that period. And where was it? Well, we don't know. There was an outbreak in the market very early on. About half the cases in December were people connected directly to the market. But the problem with that is that the Chinese authorities very early on in the first part of January were saying, if you have pneumonia in Wuhan and you had a connection to the market, then we will isolate you and investigate because you've probably got this new disease. If you didn't have a connection with the market, if you've not been there or you don't live near it, then we will assume you don't. We will assume you've got some other kind of pneumonia. So there's what's called an ascertainment bias, whereby the market cases were spotted earlier because you had to be a market case to be defined as a SARS-CoV-2 case, COVID case. So that's our problem. But we can't be sure, but we think it was circulating in Wuhan in late 2019, in November. And we badly need more collaboration and cooperation from the Chinese to trace the early cases. US intelligence says there were 3 workers from that lab, from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, who went to hospital with a pneumonia-like illness and symptoms very like COVID in November of 2019. Now, I don't have sufficient security clearance to be able to check that information, but we are told that with significant assurance by the intelligence authorities. So that might be important information, but we can't check it.
You wrote a blog post titled, "Why Did Scientists Suppress Lab Leak Theory?" Do you have a theory as to why this was suppressed as opposed to openly discussed?
Yes, there was a coordinated attempt to shut down all discussion of the lab leak as a possibility in January and February of 2020. We know this because we've seen the emails in which they discuss devising an article that they can then publish and point to, saying, case closed, this is the market, not the lab, and we can assure everyone of that. At the same time, those very scientists who wrote that article were saying to each other in private, you know what, this looks awfully like it might have come out of the lab. We don't know. Some of the features of its genome look like it's been manipulated in a lab, not just kept in a lab. And so the extraordinary disconnect between what they were saying in private and what they were saying in public came to light as a result of a number of emails surrounding a key meeting on the 1st of February 2020 between some US and UK virologists. The motivation was clearly not to get science into trouble and not to endorse Donald Trump's ideas about what was going on, and to support Chinese colleagues who were, furious at the idea that they might be accused of starting this pandemic. So there's actually no one with a vested interest in saying, actually, this might have come from a lab. There's no one who, as part of their paid day job, thinks, "Ooh, I really want it to be from a lab." You know, the scientists didn't want that. The Chinese authorities didn't want that. The politicians in the West didn't want that because they didn't want to rock the boat in diplomatic relations with China. The environmentalists didn't want that because they wanted this to be a cautionary tale about destruction of the rainforest and so on. So actually, not vested interests aren't everything. People can go against their vested interests. And I, as a big fan of science and a huge supporter of biotechnology in particular, do not have a vested interest in this being a lab story. It will do damage to some of the science that I admire and value if that turns out to be the case. But I have to follow the truth wherever it takes us. And Alina and I started out very open-mindedly. And by the time we'd finished writing the book, we were convinced that it was probably more likely that it came out of the laboratory. And we've clearly laid out some of the information we would need to solve the problem. That's the information we're still waiting for.
You mentioned in another blog post, I think it was titled, "I was duped by lab leak deniers," where you had mentioned there was a previous lab leak in, I think, Britain during the foot and mouth thing. Can you discuss previous lab leaks? I think it was 2007.
Yes, well, there's a number of cases. I mean, labs have leaked smallpox in Britain in the 70s, flu in China in the 70s, brucellosis in China in 2019, anthrax in the Soviet Union in the late 1970s, a leak that was denied for many years, and then eventually when the Soviet Union collapsed, was confirmed to have happened. So outbreaks that have killed people have happened frequently. SARS itself leaked 6 times from labs in Beijing, Singapore, and Taiwan. The first SARS, that was, and actually killed people on one of those occasions. But the one you're referring to is a really interesting case. It's an animal disease, so it didn't kill anybody, but it's called foot and mouth disease. It affects cattle. It broke out in 2007 on a farm in Surrey in England, which was 13 miles from the world's leading reference laboratory for foot and mouth virus. Now, that turned out not to be a coincidence, you will not be surprised to hear. It turned out there was a leaking pipe at the lab, and a contractor had been called in to mend it, and the contractor had then gone straight to a farm. Nobody realized that the leaking pipe was actually leaking live virus, and he had infected cattle on the farm. So the problem was solved quite quickly, and it was contained, and not many animals had to be killed. But the point is, it wasn't a geographical coincidence. Now, this outbreak began within 8 miles of the world's leading laboratory for SARS-like coronaviruses from bats, in an area where they aren't found naturally in bats, thousands of miles from where they're normally collected in southern China and Southeast Asia. So it may be a coincidence, but it doesn't look like it. It looks like we should take very seriously the possibility that the geographical coincidence may be telling us something. As Humphrey Bogart put it in Casablanca, of all the gin joints in all the towns in all the world, she should walk into mine.
You wrote a book, The Evolution of Everything, How New Ideas Emerge. Mr. Ridley, how do new ideas emerge?
My argument there was that we tend to think of the world in top-down terms. We say somebody decides in government or inside a big company that we must invent X, and we invent X. Or somebody decides that we're going to solve such and such a philosophical or political problem or something. And actually, the world doesn't work that way. The world is a much more bottom-up place, a much more emergent place. Many of the new things that happen in the world arise without direction, without planning, without authorship. An awful lot of them come from ordinary people interacting and developing new ideas among themselves. So, for example, if you think about language, the English language or any other language is a man-made thing. It is not a natural phenomenon, but it is not the product of a committee, a few geniuses, or some kind of planning operation within a government or anything else. It evolves. It changes from year to year. New words come in, old words go out, new linguistic habits, new syntax, new grammar, all this kind of thing happens, not because anyone's in charge, but because ordinary people do a form of natural selection, good old-fashioned evolution. They say, just take a simple example. When we use words frequently, they're nearly always short. So if there's a new word floating around like COVID-19, right, we shorten it. Within a few weeks, we're saying COVID. And even that's shorter than coronavirus, So who decides that? I mean, who's it, where did that come from? Who's the person who said, let's shorten words when we use them a lot because it makes life easier? Well, nobody did, and everybody did. It's the same with the internet, interestingly. Who invented the internet? Well, it wasn't Al Gore, but it wasn't Vint Cerf or one of these other brilliant people either. They made important contributions, but we all invented the internet, and we're all reinventing it all the time. So that my purpose in that book was to get people to stop thinking in terms of solving the world's problems in a top-down, dirigiste, directive way, and think about solving them through evolution, through allowing people to interact and find solutions in a sort of collective way, but not in a way in which there's someone in charge of the collective.
You wrote a book, The Rational Optimist, where you highly praise Adam Smith, a book written in 1776, I believe, titled An Inquiry into the Causes of the Wealth of Nations. What is the most important thing you learned from the works of Adam Smith?
I think Adam Smith is a towering figure. I hadn't read him until I was an adult. I wasn't taught economics. I came to him later in life. But the more I go through life, the more I keep coming back to some of the insights that he had into the world. I mean, the first point, which actually is in some ways emerges from his earlier book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1759, is that the world is a bottom-up place, that things emerge, that morality is something that emerges from the way we interact with each other rather than is taught by priests, as it were, particularly. And so, for example, that's one of the points he makes. But in The Wealth of Nations, he invents economics. And what he does is he points out the enormous significance of the division of labor and the importance of specialization and exchange. That actually, if you and I are both living in the Stone Age and we need a spear and an axe, you could make your own spear and your own axe, or I could make my own spear and my own axe. But if we say, Keith, you make both spears, I'll make both axes, and then we'll swap, then actually it's going to take us less time. Because you're going to get good at making spears, I'm going to get good at making axes, and we're both going to, by specialization and then exchanging, we're going to be better off. And that, in the end, is the great insight about human beings as opposed to other species, about how we operate and why we operate the way we do. It's an enormously significant insight. And just think about this for a moment. As the world modernizes, as we move forward into the 21st century, what I think has been happening for several hundred years is that people become more and more specialized in what they produce, but more and more diversified in what they consume. So, if you were self-sufficient, if you had to make your own clothing, make your own food, make your own lighting, make your own shelter, you wouldn't live a very high quality of life, and you wouldn't have any leisure time to consume movies or anything like that. You'd spend your whole day trying to make a candle or make or catch an animal to eat or something like that. So self-sufficiency is really another word for poverty. And yet what we've done is we've said, I'm going to do something called a job, which is, I don't know, making podcasts or something like that. And I'm going to supply the product of my job to everyone else in the world in exchange for all the things they can produce. So actually, we shouldn't be afraid of specialization because specialization, people often lament, oh, jobs are very boring, you get stuck in your job and it's very tedious, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, but the point of the job is so that you can spend the other 8 hours of the day consuming movies and going to restaurants and consuming the products of other people's work. And so the great insight of Adam Smith, I think, is how we all worked out how to work for each other and thereby increase our living standards.
I love that answer. It's almost like he's taken the individual self-interest and harmonized it with the collective self-interest through the concept of specialization. Because what appears to be a contradiction, it's like, so John Maynard Keynes is like, okay, so everyone's selfish, yet everyone is helping each other. This makes no sense at all. This is a total contradiction. But he didn't read the book published 200 years before his terrible book, which actually it explains it, as you do in The Rational Optimist.
I think, to be fair to Keynes, he probably did read Adam Smith. I would doubt he had not read him. But
he read it, but I guess he didn't appreciate it to the extent I guess anyone else did. When it comes to the modern day, if you talk to, say, a millennial, just things are horrible, the environment's bad, we have inflation, we have all of these bubbles, we have this inequality, there's poverty in the world. What are some of the bullet points that you list to the average person who says, things are so horrible today, how dare you write a book titled The Rational Optimist?
Yeah, well, part of my motivation and part of where I came from to write this book was I remember people saying exactly the same thing when I was young. I mean, I was young in the 1970s. I was told that the population explosion was unstoppable, famine was inevitable, pollution was going to shorten our lifespan through cancer. The rainforest was disappearing, the deserts were advancing, the oil was running out. There was a litany of gloom and doom, which I believed. I fell for it. I was a genuinely pessimistic young person in the 1970s. Oh my God, there's no future for my country, my species. The world's going to be grim in the future. No point in getting a decent job or trying to be ambitious. We just got to see whether we can survive this horrible thing. Because the grown-ups told me that the future was dreadful. And they never said anything about how it might not be dreadful. Now, 40 years later, the world is wonderful compared with when I was a teenager. Poverty in the world has collapsed. It's disappeared. That's not quite true. Of course, there is still poverty. But, you know, when I was born, about half the world lived on less than $2 a day in today's money. That's the sort of a definition of extreme absolute poverty. Today, way less than 10% does that. That's incredible. Nobody has ever lived through a transformation as great as that. Child mortality is down. Lifespan is up by 5 hours a day over my lifespan. Most infectious diseases have disappeared. The cancer rates are falling if you adjust for age. We're healthier, wealthier, cleverer, cleaner, kinder, freer, more peaceful, more equal. Equality has improved globally dramatically. People in poor countries have been getting rich much faster than people in rich countries. So the catalogue of improvements during the period when we were supposed to be having a really miserable time is something that I feel evangelical about telling young people. So when the adults tell you today, you're doomed, climate change, etc., take it with a pinch of salt. Look at the data, make your own mind up, and consider the possibility that they might be wrong, because they have a huge vested interest in selling gloom and doom. It sells newspapers, it sells books. I would have sold far more copies. You were kind enough to mention that I've sold a lot of copies of my books, but I would have sold far more copies if I'd written a pessimistic book than an optimistic book. I know that for sure. Just to give you a little thought experiment to realize how adrift people are from the realities of the world. If you say to people, as Hans Rosling did in a brilliant experiment to 1,000 people in a poll, he said, has the percentage of the world that lives in extreme poverty doubled, halved, or stayed the same in the last 20 years? About 65% of people in America, similar percentage in Britain, said it's doubled. The percentage of people in the world who live in extreme poverty has doubled in 20 years. About 30% said it had stayed the same, and only 5% said it had halved. The 5% were right. The 65% and the 30% were wrong. Okay, so only 5% of us know that. But hang on, said Rosling. If I had asked that question of a chimpanzee by writing those three answers on 3 different bananas and throwing them into a cage and seeing which banana it picked up first, it would answer that question right 33% of the time, not 5% of the time. So it would do 6 times as well as people at answering a question about human society that people can just look up on the internet. How can that be? And the answer, of course, as to how that can be is that, as Josh Billings, a 19th century sage, put it, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that ain't so. So it's, you know, we're convinced we know things about the world that turn out to be wrong. And so one of the things we have to do, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, is disenthrall young people about the things that they've imbibed, which are simply wrong about the world. And one of them is that it's going to hell in a handcart. It's not.
Yeah, the concept of humility is so important. Just asking people today that things are horrible. I mean, gosh, look at what's going on in Ukraine. Oh, things were so much better when I was a kid. I said, look, Grandma, I love you, but when you were a kid, there was literally Stalin going into Ukraine, killing far more people than have died today. You're just not right about this. Also, you lived through the Second World War and Korea and Vietnam. You got to stop this. Yes, it's bad, but please stop pretending it's the end of the world.
Yes, but I'm also very careful not to turn Panglossian. If you remember, Dr. Pangloss said, the things are for the best in the best of all possible worlds. You can't improve on this world because God made it, and it therefore must be perfect. And if people are dying, they must be bad people, so that's a good thing. And Voltaire is mocking this theodicy, this philosophy. And I'm not here to say the world's perfect. I'm saying the world is a lot better than it was for most people 50 years ago. But that means it can be a lot better still in 50 years. It's a veil of tears today compared with what it could be in a few decades' time. And yes, I mean, every year since that book, The Rational Optimist, came out, I've given talks about it. And every year people have said, well, you can't still surely be an optimist. I mean, come on. Have you seen what's happening with the Euro crisis? Have you seen what's happening with Ebola? Have you seen what's happening with Syria? Have you seen what's happening with Ukraine? Etc. There's always an excuse to think, well, hang on, this is as bad as it ever gets. And my answer was, yes, Ukraine is terrible. Yes, Syria is terrible. Yes, Ebola is a nasty disease. But that doesn't mean that everything is going wrong. Look at all the countries that haven't got wars, but did have them 10 years ago or something like that. Try and see the whole. If something has dropped out of the news, if some country has dropped out of the news, chances are it's quite peaceful.
What is prosperity and how can it be measured?
Well, in the end, for me, prosperity is the ability to fulfill needs and wants. So to be able to supply yourself with enough food, enough shelter, enough lighting. Lighting is one of my favorite examples of this. If you want to read a book by artificial light for an hour with an ordinary lamp, it costs you about a third of a second of work to achieve that, okay, on the average US wage. Back in 1880, with a kerosene lamp, it would have taken you 15 minutes of work on the average wage to afford that. And back in 1800, with a tallow candle, it would have cost you about 6 hours of work to have 1 hour of light. So that, for me, is the great measure. How much time do you have to work to fulfill a need or to fulfill a want, to supply yourself with lighting and shelter and food and entertainment and all these other things you want? And if you take less and less time to fulfill more and more needs and desires, then you're becoming more prosperous.
Interesting. So instead of this GDP measure, which is, I mean, easily manipulated, whether it's the Federal Reserve increasing the money supply, it's almost impossible to measure. You're saying that it's the amount of time it takes individuals to achieve something, to achieve their end, compared to what it would have been 10, 20, 30, 50 years ago. Is that correct?
Yes, I think the labor cost of fulfilling a need is a really good measure of how well off you are. And on the whole, the labor cost of most things has gone down and down and down, most consumer goods. But the labor cost of, how long you have to work to be able to buy, education at a good university or to buy a house, that's gone up for a lot of people. So not everything's going in the right direction, but most of the things supplied by government or in some sense by a heavily regulated world tend to have gone up in labor cost, but most things supplied by the market tend to have gone down in cost. That must be telling us something about the efficiency of supply.
What does it mean to say the world improves when ideas have sex?
This was a phrase that I came up with, and it enabled me to have some sort of cheap sensationalism to spread my ideas. When ideas have sex, I actually mean it in a really quite literal way. If you look at evolution by natural selection, biological evolution, sexual reproduction plays a critical role, because what it does is it brings together innovations in one lineage and combines them with innovations in another lineage. So you might inherit from your mother, some extraordinary skill that nobody else has got, and you might inherit from your father some different skill that nobody else has got, but you've got both of them. So that's what sex does. Sex enables innovation in evolution to be cumulative, to mean that you don't have to choose between, different traits and say, well, one lineage has got fur and the other lineage has got fast, it runs fast or something. You say, let's have a furry animal that runs fast. Let's put them both together. So that's what sex does, is it brings together, the technical term is recombination. It recombines genes so that you end up with new combinations of genes. Well, I think a very similar process happens in human innovation, whether it's innovation in ideas or innovation in machines. Because the more you study innovation, the more you see that it happens when people bring their ideas together and combine them. And most of the new things in the world are actually not new in the sense that they're just new combinations of existing things. The iPhone is basically, a telephone and a diary and a torch and a compass and a calculator all sort of combined together. So what I mean by when ideas have sex, I mean when a new idea meets another new idea and comes together through the process of exchange. What's critical is that human beings have this habit of exchange, saying, I've got lots of these things, you've got lots of those things, let's come together. Or I've got this idea, you've got that idea. That's very unusual. Most animals don't do that. It's because we did that our ideas were able to have sex and produce new baby ideas. My favorite example, by the way, of ideas having sex is a thing called the pill camera, which is a device that you swallow and it takes a picture of your insides for medical reasons. And it came about after a conversation over a garden fence between a gastroenterologist and a guided missile designer. That's a very nice example of ideas having sex.
I love this quote from page 46. The cumulative acceleration of knowledge by specialists that allows us each to consume more and more different things by each producing fewer and fewer is, I submit, the central story of humanity. So many great insights from this book, The Rational Optimist. What is your general thesis in the book, How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom?
Well, I realized I'd been writing about innovation in one way or another for a number of books, but I'd never taken it head on. I've never taken, what is this phenomenon of innovation? Why does it happen to us and not to rabbits or rocks? Why does it happen more in Silicon Valley than in Zimbabwe? What is it about innovation that, how do you turn it on? How do you turn it off, etc.? And in some ways, it's a pretty mysterious process. If you talk to politicians about how to do it, you get a lot of hand waving. You get a lot of people saying, well, you have to fund science. You have to make sure that there's plenty of finance available for innovators. No, come on. Tell me, what is it? What's the silver bullet that will make innovation happen in your country? And they can't answer that question. Nobody really knows why Silicon Valley suddenly did this extraordinary burst of innovation in the second half of the 20th century. Yes, you can talk about defense spending and good universities and venture capitalists going there and plenty of immigrants and all that kind of thing. But it's a pretty woolly recipe, really. And you can say the same about Victorian Britain or Renaissance Italy or Song China, periods when there was bushfires of innovation. bursting out. Maybe bushfires isn't a great metaphor for California at the moment, but you get the point. So that's what I set out in this book to do, was to decide, to analyze, to tell stories of innovations, airplanes, computers, toilets, anything that's been invented in the last few hundred years, and try and see what themes emerged. And the big theme was freedom. If people have the freedom to experiment, freedom to collaborate, freedom to fail, freedom to move and try somewhere else where there's a more congenial environment, freedom to follow their ideas, to invest behind their ideas. These are the things that really make it happen. But the first point I made in that book is that innovation is more than invention. Invention is only a small part of it. Coming up with a bright idea, a prototype of something, is a very small part of making that thing into a usable, affordable, available, and reliable tool. And the unsung heroes are the people who turn a bright idea into something that actually you can buy on Amazon for a very small amount of money. Do you see what I mean? That seems to me to be the aspect of innovation we tend to neglect. We talk about the inventors a lot. We give them patents. We make statues to them, but actually it's the innovators. It's the people who work out how to manufacture this thing in a reliable way and get it to people when they need it, in a form that they want, and in an attractive form. If you're Steve Jobs or someone like that, these are the guys. So Jeff Bezos is a great innovator in the sense of e-commerce being very much something that he's pioneered, but he's not an inventor, and he wouldn't claim to be. But he's done a lot of good to the world. You can argue that you don't approve of some of the things he's done, etc., but that's a different debate. But he has changed the world as an innovator rather than an inventor.
On page 6, you say serendipity plays a big part in innovation, which is why liberal economies with their free roving experimental opportunities do so well. They give luck a chance. Innovation happens when people are free to think, experiment, and speculate. What else? It's so scary to say, let's trust a process instead of a result. So instead of embracing the process of freedom, well, things can go to heck in a handbasket. What we need is a leader to design something that'll really make it happen. Why should, how would you sell people on the process of freedom of experimentation being the way you want to achieve innovation, as opposed to, say, something that's very written in stone that allows us all to look at the same thing and follow a single path?
Well, the history of inventions is that again and again people set out to invent one thing and end up inventing something else. Art Fry invented the Post-it note when he was by accident at 3M. Stephanie Kwolek invented Kevlar by accident when looking for something else. There's tons of examples of this. But I think the best example of the importance of experimentation is actually a very old one, and that is the Wright brothers. There was a man named Samuel Langley who was a brilliant astrophysicist and probably the cleverest man in America. And he was head of the Smithsonian Institution. And he said to the US government, give me $25,000 and I will invent a powered airplane. I know how to do it now. So they gave him the money. He said, no, I don't need to talk to anyone. It's all in here. I'm going to do it in secret in case anyone tries to steal my ideas. And then I'll unveil it when it's ready. And he unveiled it on top of a houseboat on the Potomac in December 1903, and launched it into the air, and it went straight into the water. And it was a complete disaster. 10 days later, on a barrier island off North Carolina, 2 bicycle mechanics without a degree between them succeeded where Langley had failed, and they got a powered plane into the air. They were just bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio. There was no crowd watching. They'd had no money from the government, anything. But what they had done is they had picked the brains of anyone and everyone who was thinking about flight anywhere in the world. In Australia, in Europe, in other parts of the US, and they had picked the brains of people doing balloons, doing kites, doing gliders, doing wind tunnel experiments, studying birds. They had drawn upon everyone and anyone. They hadn't decided they were the cleverest person and they knew how to do it inside their own head. And then they had done a ton of experiments. They'd done 4 years of experiments with gliders before they even tried to put an engine on this thing. And they had, by trial and error, they had worked out how you steer a glider in the air. I mean, it's not a trivial point. If you're in the middle of, if you're flying through the air, how do you turn right and turn left? It's not obvious to start with. So all these things came together. And so they're a very good example of how you should do innovation. And Langley was a very good example of how not to do it, with a government grant and knowing exactly how you're going to get there in the first place.
In this book, you tell a number of stories of how innovation comes to fruition. Do you have any favorite stories in this book that really illustrate your thesis here?
Actually, my favorite one is a slightly odd one, and it's the insecticide-treated bed net to solve malaria, something that's been championed by the Gates Foundation as a mechanism of solving malaria. Malaria was increasing in the 1990s globally, killing more people every year. Now it's been decreasing since 2003. Why? In 2003, the insecticide-treated bed net started to be distributed. It turns out to be a brilliant solution. It deters mosquitoes as well as killing them. It works even if it's got a hole in it. And I thought, this is a really interesting example. It's very low-tech innovation. It could have been done decades before it was. Who did it? How was it discovered? And it's not a well-known story. I mean, nobody had written it up. So I tracked down the 2 French scientists who'd worked with colleagues in Burkina Faso in the 1980s and set up a system in some experimental huts, which were designed for these experiments, where they'd made 36 people sleep in these huts night after night with different designs of mosquito net, and then measured how many mosquitoes had come into the hut, how many had gone out, how many had died, how many had got a blood meal, and so on, and did just a beautiful experiment that showed that mosquito nets were quite good at stopping you getting bitten. Mosquito nets with insecticide on them were much better, even if they had holes in them. Even if, in the course of wear and tear, mosquito nets tend to get torn. So you think, oh, that's useless. The mosquito will find the hole. But if it's got insecticide on it, it's such a deterrent that the mosquitoes don't find the hole. And this showed that, 95% reduction in your chances of being bitten by a mosquito if you've got one of these things over your bed. A very simple experiment, beautifully designed, done in Africa by some rather humble scientists. I tracked down the French scientist, talked to him, and he didn't speak English, so my French isn't very good, so it wasn't very easy. But so that ended up being my favorite, because I think millions of lives have been saved by this low tech development, and I like that for that example.
Imagine Boris Johnson steps down tomorrow, everyone else steps down in the English Parliament, and a new state arises. What advice would you give them on some simple rules they could embrace if they want to, say, have a much more innovative society that can compete with places like China, Japan, and every other country in the world?
Well, I think starting from a blank slate is just sort of too utopian. I can hardly imagine it. I mean, yeah, sure, I would have a lot of fun doing that. But I think more important is to say what advice can you give from here to governments to try and improve their innovative capacity? And I've actually been giving that advice to Boris and others in a very lowly way. I'm not a trusted advisor or anything, but I've been banging the drum for innovation. And there are some really quite simple things, like get government to take faster decisions. if you talk to entrepreneurs, they go on and on about the extraordinary waste of time getting a government agency to give a decision about something. And you'd much rather they just said, no, you can't do that, than that they take 3 years to say yes, by which time your competitors have stolen a march on you. I detail in the book how it took 8 years for the European Union to approve a genetically modified potato, by which time the inventor had said, well, get lost. I'm off to America. I can't wait 8 years for a decision. So, that's a very simple thing. Just get faster decisions out of government, because government agencies have no incentive to take a fast decision. For them, taking no decision is much safer bet. You don't lose your job if you take no decision, if you just punt it down the road into the long grass. Whereas if you take the wrong decision, you might lose your job. So there's a real problem of incentives here. And regulation is a huge problem for innovators. It's often, regulations that aren't really anything to do with the innovation. I mean, if you think about nuclear power is a perfectly good technology, incredibly safe, incredibly effective. It kills far fewer people than renewable energy, actually, per unit of energy it produces. And yet it's stuck in a hugely high cost, non-innovative form. We're basically using the same designs as we used in the 1960s. Why? Because the regulations over what you must do to get a new design approved are so expensive and so time consuming that nobody bothers. Nobody says, let's do trial and error, let's see what we can do. And also, once you get a design approved, you can't change it. You can't halfway through the construction process say, actually, there's a better way of doing this. We want to do it slightly differently, which is what innovators do the whole time, in cars or in silicon chips or something. They change direction. They learn as they're going along and say, actually, there's a better way of doing this. You can't do that in nuclear. You have to have the whole thing approved before you even start. And that means you only try something safe that you already know. Safe is fine, but you can't. That means you can't get safer things. You get old-fashioned designs that cost enormous amounts of money, that are over-engineered, etc., etc. So there's lots of things you can do to just free up innovators to have more opportunity to try things. Open up trial and error would be the theme that I would bang into the heads of my ministers every 5 minutes. When I was a dictator, which thank God I'm not going to be.
Let's take the thesis of these books, Evolution of Everything, How Innovation Works, The Rational Optimist, and apply them to today. The only case I'm really familiar with is America. There is a new organization designed by the Department of Homeland Security, terribly Orwellian term, but that's what they're called, where they have a new organization called the Governing Board of Disinformation, run by a woman named Nina Jankowicz. Now, they're saying that what we need, things are so terrible. In this marketplace of ideas, you might get false information. And this false information could lead to terribly bad things. That's why we need to regulate the space of ideas. How do you talk to someone with that mindset where they say, instead of having a society where bad ideas can come to fruition, we need to regulate them. This way, the correct ideas come to the forefront and we can be an educated population?
Yeah, well, as you allude, the problem is top-down thinking. It goes right back to my evolution of everything theme, which is that we constantly see the world in top-down through top-down lens. We think in terms of there's a problem, so let's put someone in charge. Let's make a czar who can solve it. There's a problem in social media. There's no question about it. There's a problem of greater extremism, greater polarization, lots of misinformation, etc., etc. And it's driving us apart in a most terrifying way, as Jonathan Haidt and others are documenting in an interesting way. But the solution is not to put one commissar in charge, however brilliant she or he may be, because she or he will have axes to grind. And I think what has emerged with Nina Jankowicz, immediately with in minutes of her being appointed was that everyone said, well, hang on, this woman has very strong views about things, which of course she does. So have I. But I shouldn't be put in charge either. It's not the matter of choosing the right person. It's a matter of choosing the collective wisdom of humankind to solve these problems. Now, Jonathan Haidt has this suggestion that the way to solve the horrible nature of social media, where loud-voiced extremists are drowning out moderates and beating up moderates a lot of the time, is to, for example, just a very simple rule. When you log on to Twitter for the first time, or other organizations, you should have a setting that automatically blocks anyone who's really rude and nasty and, does things in an ad hominem way. And you can have that setting at anything up to 1 to 5. And let's say, you start off with it 4, and you can lower it. You can say, I don't want to hear anybody who's even remotely rude. I just want to hear polite people, and I can lower it. Or you can raise it and say, actually, I can't want to hear with these people who are really screaming at each other. But that way, I think we've got to find a way of taming this medium. And the way is not to put in charge a disinformation minister, because a lot of things get labeled disinformation that turn out to be true. I mean, the lab leak is a classic example. The lab leak may be true. The US government says it's a definite possibility. The World Health Organization says it's a definite possibility. But for months in 2020, you were called by the New York Times, by Facebook, by anyone, a conspiracy theorist for even considering it. And that's a disgrace. I'm sorry, but that was playing into the hands of Chinese propaganda, we now know. And that's partly where it was coming from. And that's what will happen if you get one person in charge of this kind of thing. They'll be a cushion. They'll bear the imprint of the last person who sat on them.
And the expressions you Brits have are so funny. The last person who sat on them. I forget where I was even going with the next thing I was saying. The point is that all of these shortcomings that we say apply to people that apply in a state of freedom where people are free to engage in voluntary exchanges also applies to human beings once they're put in these positions of power. Nina Jankowicz obviously fell for this ridiculous scam that said Hunter Biden's laptop with all of his pictures on it were actually a plant by Putin and the Kremlin. And then 4 years earlier, Hillary Clinton said 17 intelligence agencies said that the emails that Trump's referring to are from Vladimir Putin, and this is Russian disinformation. On both attempts, they were totally wrong. They said, "Hey, a nuclear power violated our governing independence," and they were wrong. No apologies or anything. So not only do they not have an incentive, if they were the most well-meaning people on the planet Earth, they still would fall short. And that's why the evolution of everything and how innovation works, I think, are so vitally important, because you say, yeah, there are this Thomas Edison guy and Nikola Tesla. These people had a lot of shortcomings. Make sure that they don't have a position of power where their shortcomings don't face any consequences, because then they won't be in this process of learning how to innovate. I absolutely love these books. I'm so appreciative that you wrote them. Do you have any favorite authors of yourself, whether it's economists, historians, philosophers?
Oh, well, lots. I mean, there are lots of people I enormously admire. Steven Pinker is a friend and a just brilliant writer and thinker. Deirdre McCloskey, what a wonderful user of the English language. Her books are probably far too long, but they're just a tremendous ride while you're reading them. And she's an economic historian, so she's talking about the history of the world and the history of ideas. Richard Dawkins, the British evolutionary biologist, taught me, and he's a friend, and he's just a superb writer and has I think, contributed great things to the to the world of ideas, actually. I wrote a book about Francis Crick, and I'm lucky enough to know James Watson, who's still alive, and Watson and Crick. It's extraordinary to me that I met both those people, because I think they made the most important scientific discovery of all time. I think it beats gravity and relativity and all that kind of thing into a cocked hat to have discovered one day, 28th of February 1953, to have suddenly realized that there is a linear digital code at the heart of all living things, and not non-living things. The double helix of DNA is what I'm referring to, is just a remarkable thing. And Jim Watson, much maligned figure these days in his old age because of various incautious things he's said, but he did write an extraordinarily good non-fiction novel about that experience called The Double Helix, which I recommend to any science writer to read. It's a remarkable and strange book. So these are some of my heroes in the world of writing, but I just love people who write well. I think it's a fabulous skill, and there's nothing better than following someone's ideas in prose.
I think McCloskey's series of books is titled Bourgeois Dignity, something in this area. Could you explain the general thesis that McCloskey attempts to explain? In this span of human history, we see a significant amount of increase in innovation in this time. It's as a result of an ethic that people embrace. Can you explain this thesis?
Yeah, well, she takes 3 books of 600 pages long each to explain them, so I may not do a very good job in 2 minutes, but I will have a crack at it. Essentially, what she's saying is that for most of human history, we valued and admired some rather dodgy virtues, things like courage and honor and things like this, and that actually led to a sort of world in which we killed our enemies and took revenge and all this kind of thing. And then there are the bourgeois values, things like prudence and making sure that 2 + 2 = 5 in your work, etc., etc., that we despise, and literature still despises them. And the movies, they're all about superheroes going around doing superhero things instead of people who go to work and make things for other people. And so she's saying that when we came to value buying low and selling high, and being in the market and supplying people with with bread for their lunch as a baker, these kind of, there was a moment in history when we sort of came to value this kind of stuff, and the result was the extraordinary enrichment of the human race. The great enrichment is the phrase she uses. So that's a sort of very, very sketchy summary of at least one of the thoughts in those books.
We have 2 minutes left, sir. Thank you so much for your time today. Do you have any advice on how people can sort of see through, I guess you could call propaganda? Well, we can assume that, let's say that the people in the media are very well intended. Do you have any advice on how people can see through propaganda or actual misinformation, and maybe how they can differentiate truth from falsehood?
Yeah, I think in the end, it boils down to always asking yourself, is it true? You hear something on the media, or you see something on the news, and you can choose to believe it or not believe it. You can choose to move on and do something else in your life. But if you're if it matters to you, if you think it's an important bit of news, just check it. It's very easy these days to check the facts behind things. I mean, I'm amazed by how people never go and look at, if there's something about a scientific discovery, just go and look up the original paper. You may not understand all of it, but you can jolly well check that, and you find, hang on a minute, this reporter's got the wrong end of the stick, or he's greatly exaggerating what these people are saying about climate change or something like that. So let's just check stuff. And because of the internet, that's easier than you don't have to go to a library. When I was young, if if I read, Paul Ehrlich saying the whole world is going to starve to death in the next 20 years, I would have had to go to a library to look up the data, etc. Now, you just click of the switch, you're onto the internet and you can check stuff. So check the facts behind the claims. It's very easy to do, and it's actually a lot of fun.
Thank you to everyone for watching the Libertarian Institute and the Keith and I Don't Tread on Anyone podcast. Mr. Ridley, thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank you very much indeed for having me on the show.